Hello, and welcome to the latest talk from NSF. And today we'll be looking at outsourcing aspects of your quality system. There are times in all of our lives when life becomes disrupted. And at these times, the routine, the norm, will go out the window. Staff that haven't stopped for the last 6 months may well now be needing a break. But who can cover to ensure that you maintain your obligations as an authorization holder? You need to think about outsourcing some of your services, and today we're going to have a think about why you would do that, what would drive that decision. We'll consider the different aspects of the operation that can be supported and what you ought to have in place in order to allow it. So welcome everyone, I'm Rachel Carmichael. I joined NSF just over 4.5 years ago, and prior to that I worked for nearly 11 years as an inspector from good manufacturing inspections with the UK competent authority, the MHRA. Prior to that, I worked for the best part of a decade with an American multinational in various roles from technical support and QA, and I'm eligible to be a qualified person. There can be internal or external factors that influence your decision. It is likely that employees will be cheaper overall than having a consultant. But when you don't have enough knowledgeable employees, such consultants can be worth the cost in order to comply with the obligations on you as an authorization holder, which is to ensure that you have adequate numbers of personnel conducting the required tasks. Internally, there can be problems in terms of delays in recruitments. Sometimes people have headcount freezes. Sometimes it's a challenge to decide exactly what sort of person you want. It may be that you need some additional support whilst new management become familiar with their new roles. And maybe you need some external eyes. If your company staff have lost what we would term true north, they perhaps are focused more on the tasks than they are on the patients. They've lost track of what the requirements are for current good manufacturing practice. And then you can have that external skill come and support and improve and give confidence to the operation. External influencing factors that determine the decision to have contractors can be an immediate loss of skills. We knew of one factory where a competing factory opened locally, and they lost a large number of their trained and experienced personnel to the new factory. Sometimes, if you're physically located in perhaps a remote part of the country, you can have difficulty recruiting. It can take a lot to encourage people to move. Sometimes these external factors are not your own choice. And so you may be under some sort of warning letter, and you may have been told that you need to get some help, even if you don't think you need it. And that can be a challenge because then you have to balance the relative reaction of people internally when oversight is imposed on them. But more positively, you can look at consultants as an improvement opportunity, recognize perhaps what your client's audits are telling you, that you need to get some support. So it may be that you recognize the need for an improvement. As ever, let's review the rules that would apply. We'd look first at Chapter 2, Personnel. In Section 2.23, there is a particular focus on the use of consultants. And it's very short. So in this section, it requires that you assess your consultants to determine that they're suitable for the role. You have to be able to prove that they have adequate education, training, and experience, or any combination thereof. And in addition, it's made clear that you need to keep records of who these consultants are, and that record needs to include their name, their address, their qualifications, and the type of service provided. That in itself is a very minor amount of information that you need to retain. However, you're using a consultant or a contractor, and they are, by definition, an outsourced service provider. And so the requirements of Chapter 7 of EU GMP also apply. Well, Chapter 7, of course, is outsourced activities, and this gives some more detail behind what you need to have in place. This is a challenge for some companies because still they've not quite moved from when this chapter used to be outsourced manufacturing and testing to cover the wider field of outsourcing. And so when you look at some companies' systems, and perhaps recognize more clearly what is in people's minds, they've not made that move. And you look at what they've got in place, and they've got the outsourced manufacturing and testing fully controlled, but they haven't really got service providers sorted out. Maybe they're still handled only by their finance department outside of the GMP processes. So you find that people are on site doing critical tasks, perhaps like calibration, and there's really next to nothing in place describing what's required of them and what is expected. So it's important to start with finance and find out who you're paying and work out whether some of those service providers are actually a GMP or a GXP service provider. Maybe they're doing audits of your pharmacovigilance system. But when you've identified those, you then need to do a risk assessment of them and think about that risk-based approach. You'll look in detail at the tasks they're undertaking and classify them into the groups that can be handled in a proportionate manner. Although you need to have all the requirements of Chapter 7 addressed, the extent and depth of detail and oversight that's required will differ according to how you classify them on your risk basis. So looking at Chapter 7, what we need to have in place is the fact that the service is appropriately defined, agreed and controlled to avoid misunderstandings. Not the sort of misunderstandings that may hurt my feelings, but the sort of misunderstandings that can result in product or operations that are unsatisfactory in terms of quality. As we all know, communication's a two-way thing, and so there are obligations on the contract giver and obligations on the contract acceptor, and these are set out in the contract, which both parties agree to. Now, this contract used to be termed a technical agreement. It's often termed a quality agreement, and regardless of what term you use, be very clear this is not a commercial contract. So try to keep them separate so that you're very clear about who's fulfilling your GMP activities, and be very confident that you're able to make them available when it comes to the inspection. These are inspectable records. So Chapter 7 also specifically states that you need to be very clear as a contract giver on how your QP will continue to fulfill their responsibilities. Just because you've hired a very experienced contractor as a support for your quality unit, that doesn't take away from the fact that it is your named qualified person who has the responsibilities. So bear in mind, of course, Chapter 7 only has minimum requirements. And when you think about your own internal systems, practically speaking, what do we need to have in place? Well, you've got to have everything in place to make sure that you are having appropriate control from a contract giver point of view. Starting with selection, you've got to look at the legality, the suitability and the competence of the contract acceptor to do the tasks that you're expecting them to carry out. Just because they're cheap, it doesn't make them good. The documentation, we're talking here about this contract, this technical agreement or quality agreement that details the principles and the guidelines of their tasks as they relate to good manufacturing practice in line with EU requirements. Looking at training, you've got to make sure that these people are trained in line with your training requirements. So if you say that everybody on site has to do something, even a contractor who's coming in for a couple of weeks would be covered by that. So make sure that you put in place a sort of allowance that lets contractors be trained in the tasks that are relevant to them, not everything as would apply to employees. Now, the contractor has to have the right information and knowledge in order to be able to do the tasks you're asking them to do fully. Sometimes contract givers get very nervous about sharing information, and we have actually seen a contractor who was not given access to the required documents in order to do what they needed to do in an informed manner. If that is your approach as a company, then you must not use a contractor. You've got to be able to use them and trust them and give them the information that they're going to require. And then we get into this whole bucket of supervising, monitoring, involving, and auditing. This is how you actually maintain an oversight, make sure that you really retain your responsibility as a contract giver, but know that the service is being provided, it is in use, it is effective in terms of delivery. Now, the ownership aspect when using contractors is key for your agreement because you've got to make sure you understand who ends up owning the product at the end of the day. The product being a report or a training course, anything that they may have developed while they're with you. It may be that you expect it to belong to you as the contract giver. You've got to make sure that your contract or your technical agreement actually spells that out. If you're dealing with a training organization, the training materials themselves are their intellectual property and they will continue to own it after the course. Finally, communication, just make sure you put in place formal processes to keep that communication going throughout the duration of the hire. The different aspects that contractors can support are wide ranging, but if you are looking to take on a contract qualified person, just remember they must be named on the license. And although you can delegate tasks to them, the responsibility remains with the qualified person who is named on your authorization. And there are particular tasks that that qualified person needs to ensure that they actually undertake. You more commonly see contractors supporting the auditing program, be they internal or external. And it's great to do co-audits with members of your team with a very experienced contractor and get the overall knowledge of your operation improved. But it may be you don't even have enough resource for that, and so the entire audit program can be contracted out. You do find that more commonly within the operation, you're looking at particular tasks that will be done, some sort of technical review or management review. It may be that the contractors are overseeing all your change controls, all your deviations to make sure that you fulfill the absolute requirements in terms of GMP. They can allow an additional focus, which when everybody's so busy can be lost when you're trying to multitask. But if you've got someone in specifically to review these aspects, they are able to focus without worrying about the business implications or the promotional opportunities. But you can also use them in validation, in stability reporting, your data trending, getting in somebody who's really great at maths and statistics purely for that element to set it up and perhaps review it on a periodic basis and make sure it's working for you and giving you useful information. And then, of course, your annual product review or your product quality reviews, getting someone in to write those may seem like a simple answer, but remember they've got to understand all of your system to be able to deliver that report in a meaningful way. So within the agreement, the technical agreement, quality agreement, contract, call it what you will, what are we going to cover? Well, there's normally a fairly standard set of information. And this is going to be really your primary tool for communicating. So within this initial section, be very clear on what is the scope of what you're expecting to be done. You've got to make sure you are trying to avoid conflicts and make sure you have clear escalation route as the work is ongoing. Anything that needs to be communicated up has to be clearly defined. Who are the contract giver? Who are the contract acceptor? Who is the named person responsible for this contract? We're going to talk specifically about what products are covered by the agreement and the sites that are involved. There must be no doubt as to which aspects they're going to be responsible for. You'll have definitions and abbreviations if it's necessary. It normally is. Most companies have an unusual sort of internal speak that can be quite unusual when you're looking at multiple companies. And then you get into the actual details of what it is you want them to do and who is going to be responsible for what. As I said earlier, we need to avoid conflicts. And so you often find that there's a very neat table summarizing all the tasks that are required. And then it will say which is the responsibility of the giver and which is the responsibility of the acceptor. Now, in this second line, you can see that they have said both parties are responsible. You need to be very clear that sometimes that can be a problem. So in this particular line, making sure you notify whenever there's some significant changes, yes, that can easily be the responsibilities of both parties. But if the task is a bit more vague, then it will not be acceptable. And there have been a number of inspection findings where the task that was described was too vague to allow both parties to be responsible for it. So when that's the case, you need to put in some subpoints and spell out who is actually going to be doing what. You need to be clear how long this agreement is in place for, who's going to approve it, who the contacts are for going forwards, and people maintain the change history. Now, clearly from an inspection point of view, the first thing to ensure is that these documents are in place. So if you haven't got one, that's a very simple issue. But once they are in place, what's the focus of the inspectorate? Well, we're looking to see that you've clearly defined the responsibilities, communicated them, and confirmed how you're going to ensure compliance. The contract giver in this technical agreement may have a standard template, and your contract acceptor may have their standard template. Before you sign any other organization's template, you need to make sure that it meets your criteria. So I have seen agreements where contract acceptors have actually signed contracts which stated that they would not be given the paperwork they needed in order to do the job. Bizarre. You do wonder how people end up in the situations they end up in. So be very clear on what your requirements are. Make sure your technical agreements includes all of the relevant information, and be very clear that your contract acceptor cannot make changes to processes or your procedures without the approval from the contract giver. So there's no changing halfway through the activity in the way that you do it because it's more convenient to you. You have to fulfill what the contract giver has given you unless you get them to agree to a change. And really critically, the subcontracting is not allowed without the agreement of the contract giver. So it should be very clear that the contract acceptor cannot get other people to do the tasks for them. Now, part of doing this agreement is recognizing that as you contract this work out, that organization now becomes an organization that may need to be audited by your own internal audit program and certainly may be inspected by the regulators. And that should be made clear in the agreement and who's going to undertake the steps and have that oversight. I hope that this has been of use. It's a talk through what is required from a technical agreement point of view and making sure that you think carefully through as you're going to contract out some tasks. It can seem like the right solution, but when you're busy and you've got to make sure that the fundamentals in place before you cause more problems for yourselves.